Welcome to Scary Stories. I want to talk about real stuff in this video. I'm not going to say there are no stories in this episode because there might be a whole bunch of stories by the end of it. But this is all stuff that happened to me and people I knew. I'm thinking of doing a short series of these about people from the past who are no longer with us, and putting some of my anecdotes about them into a form that others who miss these individuals might appreciate. Like, I'm thinking about doing one about John Keel, who I was friends with, that I was mentored by for years. I'm thinking about doing one about crazy Tim Beckley, Mr. UFO, Mr. Creepo, or maybe underground filmmaker Nick Zed, Joey Ramone, who I once got to work for, and obviously this guy I'm starting off with who created Fangoria magazine. There are some comedians I worked with who some of you might know, but sadly, they're all still alive, so they don't fit this new format. I may never follow through on my threat to do those other people, by the way. I'm just telling you what I'm thinking out loud. Each of these people are individuals who are complicated, and who I had strange experiences with. I do have happy anecdotes, but like I said, the histories get complicated. I don't want to get too heavily into the bad stuff, but I don't want to sugarcoat it either. I'd like to talk about these guys in ways that they wouldn't mind if they were listening. In the case of Nick Zed, that'll be impossible, as nothing could please him. And I have to say the same about the main subject of this episode, Uncle Bob Martin, the creator of Fangoria magazine. In fact, my stories of Nick and Bob are mixed together in their beginnings. I guess first I would have to explain the kind of excitement that existed around Bob's magazine Fangoria in those days. Podcaster Frank Nora talks about the early David Letterman show, and the excitement and electricity around it for college-age audiences back in those days. For those of us who were later-day monster kids, growing up on the tail end of the famous Monsters of Filmland and Monster Times eras, Fangoria magazine was the late night with David Letterman of horror magazines. It was smart. It was funny. It had Mexican wrestling horror films in it. Plenty of in-jokes for the regular customers, and a charismatic character in the center, Uncle Bob Martin. I should pause now to point out that I'm talking about Robert H. Martin, not Robert C. Martin, who is a computer programmer that was apparently accused of something sexual or something. He also goes by the name of Uncle Bob Martin, but he is not the guy I mean. I'm talking about Robert H. Martin, who was asked by Starlog magazine to create a monster magazine to go along with their science fiction one. They expected him to come back with something like Famous Monsters of Filmland. Bob decided he would call himself Uncle Bob, like Forrest J. Ackerman was Uncle Fari. But beyond that, Bob wanted to break new ground. Uncle Bob's great innovation in how he personally changed Western culture was that he printed up-close, clear, full-color pictures of blood and gore from the then-current new wave of R and X-rated horror films. Bob had to fight to get that to happen. And he got a reputation for being difficult to work with because, I want to say because he was a visionary. But also, Bob was emotional. He could really hurt your feelings, man. Especially if you loved him. But in the case of Gore and Fangoria, Bob was in the right. All through this past December 2023, Fangoria was emailing me pictures of old issues that Bob had been the editor of, trying to get me to buy back issues at $20 each. Some of them go for over $100 on eBay, so I guess that's a good price, but my point is, Bob died 3 years ago, and they're still selling the stuff he fought against them to create for them back in the 1980s. Think about it for a second. So anyway, way back when, Uncle Bob had run an ad in Fangoria saying he wanted to appear in someone's horror film, but the prerequisite was that he had to die on screen in some horrible way. Nick Zed got in touch with Bob and said he wanted to decapitate him. And Bob said, "Groovy." So that's how Bob ended up getting murdered on screen by the Formaldehyde Man in the underground classic Geek Maggot Bingo, which I was at the premiere night of looking to get interviews for my college newspaper. I did not meet Bob there, but I met Nick Zed and Donna Death and some others on the Lower East Side alternative and punk scenes. I guess I was 17 or 18. I didn't actually meet Uncle Bob until I was 19, but I'm pretty sure it was Nick Zed who put the two of us together. Even though the two of them never really got along. I remember in the very late 90s running into Nick at the Gershwin Hotel, which had a small rock club that the remainders of the old Warhol people used to hang out in. I asked Nick if he had heard from Uncle Bob, who had disappeared. Nick looked at me straight-faced and asked, "Uncle Bob Martin?" Didn't he become an alcoholic? Bob was an alcoholic from the word go. I'll get back to that. But anyway, Bob had either quit in a huff or gotten fired from Fangoria, I don't really remember. But I decided with my then girlfriend that we should approach him about doing a new magazine. A magazine that would be horror but also everything else cool. I was 19, my girlfriend was 21, and we asked Bob for a meeting. He lived in New Jersey and we were in Brooklyn, so we met up in the West Village by the PATH train back to Hoboken in a bagel shop. Bob wanted to do a magazine called Countdown to Millennium, which would be more like the Weekly World News than Fangoria, picking out weird stories from all over the world. Like a book by Charles Fort but written as a magazine. It would end when it became the 21st century and everything went to shit. We never really got serious about any kind of magazine, but we started to play Dungeons and Dragons together each weekend. I was the DM. Everyone would meet at our place, which at first was in Brooklyn and then Groove Street in Jersey City. I would get Bob a jug of wine, which in those days was between $5 and $7 depending. Bob and the others would come over Friday night, play till 8 or 9 a.m. when Pee-wee's Playhouse came on Saturday morning, and then we'd all crash until Saturday night when we'd go to the video store and let the real Uncle Bob from Fangoria pick out a double feature for us. Bob would sleep over, sometimes on 2 chairs he pushed together, until his jug of wine was finished. Sometimes that was Tuesday, sometimes it was Wednesday. Then he'd go back to Hoboken, but he'd be back Friday, when I would have bought him a new jug of wine. It reached a point where he would tell me what kind of wine he wanted next time before he'd leave. And after a while, my girlfriend told me Bob was a bad influence on me. I'm not even lying. I was around 20 years old, and he was a very talented writer who was super knowledgeable about pop culture. Bob Martin changed my life when he sat me down and showed me the Devo documentary on VHS, We're All Devo. He explained parts that I didn't know. He was a Devo superfan, and he made me one too. I had thought they were a joke band, but Bob pointed out that they were doing sophisticated media satire, which had flown right over my teenage head. Years later, I was doing a fake band when Gerald Casali of Devo asked me to have my fake cartoon girls sing one of his songs, and they did it. I thought Bob would be happy, but Bob was sort of against being happy. So that girlfriend that told me that Uncle Bob was a bad influence on me, when I talk to her about him these days, we mostly seem to remember his amazing stories of his own life, like the time Joe Dante helped him save face during an interview, the time Tom Savini almost smothered him while turning him into a zombie. Hear this zombie for Day of the Dead. That's the legendary makeup artist Tom Savini on the right, and green-faced Uncle Bob Martin on the left. This was actually what Bob looked like by Sunday morning, so I don't know where the makeup came into play. I'm joking, of course. Bob would rant about how Savini wasn't so great, but his complaints didn't sound so legit to me. He got warm under some clay on his face or something? Okay, big deal. I was kind of on Savini's side on that one, definitely. It's the most memorable and iconic image of Uncle Bob, him sitting as a zombie with Tom Savini on the cover of Fangoria number 43. But of course Bob would complain about it and he'd gripe. Bob had a compulsion to try out every new bar that he came across. On more than one occasion, we would be walking and he would have to go inside a bar that we were walking past. Like the Wakamba on 8th or 9th Avenue. Same with strip clubs, he had to go inside. Now, I rarely went into bars with him, but I never went into the strip clubs. I didn't need to. He would tell me everything that happened in detail the next time I'd see him. He liked to go into bars that looked tough, get drunk, go around insulting people, until he got into a fight. By fight, he basically meant being beaten up and thrown out. I laughed when I saw Frank Henenlotter, the horror filmmaker who made the Basket Case series on streaming, being interviewed. And his story about Uncle Bob started with, I walked into a titty bar and there was Uncle Bob Martin from Fangoria, waving me over. And when Bob got thrown out of the titty bar, as he would say, then he'd go to an after-hours club and have further adventures. I remember when he was writing the novelization of one of Henenlotter's movies, Bob would moan and groan about how hard writing was, and all that kind of thing. He had this need to be miserable, even when he got to co-write screenplays with Henenlotter later on. Bob was the suffering artist. That part of knowing Bob was a bad influence on me. And I'm going to pause now to tell the story of who broke me out of the suffering artist mode. there's a lady who at least sometimes lives in an apartment under where I've been living for many years. And she's won an Emmy, and she's at least a face that you would know. She's acted in a number of high-profile shows and films. Before she won her Emmy, she asked me in the elevator one day how it was going with my life, and I was really bummed out that my YouTube channel wasn't being judged on whether it was entertaining, but if the stories were based on provable cases or not. Like, I wanted to do The Twilight Zone, but the audience wanted one step beyond, which was all true stories. So this future Emmy winner told me I had no right to feel sorry for myself. Every day I get to write and record another episode of my show. I'm spending another day at least trying to live out my dream. Some people never get to do that. So when it gets hard for me, and when I have to make sacrifices, that pain that comes from giving things up, that's something I have to be grateful for. Because if I'm sacrificing to remain an artist, that means I'm still an artist. And you never know when that'll get taken away from you. So she told me I'm not allowed to complain again until the day when I'm unable to continue writing, but not 1 second before. She humbled me and she changed my life. Now, if Uncle Bob had gotten that lecture, he'd have blown up. Like one time I told him that baseball players swing a bat with a weight on it before they go up to the plate. This way the regular bat feels light when it comes time for them to swing it live pitching. Bob didn't understand what I meant, but I was saying if writing seems like such a heavy chore, then put some weights on and try doing it now. When you take the weights off again, the work becomes lighter. Now Bob still didn't understand because I was offering him solutions, and he didn't want solutions. He wanted to suffer as an artist. Duh. I think it was glamorous to him, like he was Van Gogh cutting his ear off or whatever. One time I said that if writing seemed hard, he should try making a comic book. The writing is the easiest part of the comic book. The drawing is the part that takes the most time. Rather than take it as I meant it, Bob chose to be insulted and argue that I was comparing his great artistic writing to mere comic book writing, which was clearly beneath him. He was actually angry that I was suggesting that he could be an artist and still enjoy himself, but whatever. Let me tell you one of my favorite Uncle Bob stories. Well, I love this story so much that back in the day I actually drew a fancy fold-out Xerox mini comic book of this story. The centerfold had a mini poster of my cartoon of Uncle Bob as a teenager. I spent weeks in secret working out the comic book and making it for his birthday. Well, Bob hated it. He said it made him look ugly, like the Joker. But to me, he was the Joker, especially in this story. So let me tell you this story. I've checked with the girlfriend who called Bob a bad influence on me, and she remembered a big part I had forgotten, but I will now include. So this is the story of how Uncle Bob Martin, creator of Fangoria, spent the summer of love in 1967. Okay, so Bob was a teenager and he was in New Jersey, right? Proud to be from New Jersey and Hoboken, home of Frank Sinatra. Like, I remember one New Year's party, Bob forced us to join him in a drunken chant of home of Frank, because he was quite proud of Sinatra. Anyway, this was 20 years earlier in 1967, and all these rock stars kept coming on Bob's TV in New Jersey and telling him about this place that was groovy. Not just groovy, but groovy. That was a detail Bob emphasized each time he'd tell the story. And this groovy place was San Francisco. So Bob ran away from home, put some flowers in his hair, and showed up at the age of 17 or 18, I guess, to become a homeless person in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. Now Bob would pause the story at this point and tell us that, you know guys, I gotta tell you, things were different in those days. You could be just standing there in the park and someone would come up with some oranges and say, hey man, you want an orange, man? And you'd be like, yeah man, I'd love an orange, thanks so much, man. And we call each other brothers, and it was this whole thing, you know? So here was the young Uncle Bob Martin. I guess back then he was just Cousin Bob. And he was living for free in an abandoned building and eating free food other people gave him. And it was the beginning of what is now known as the Summer of Love. It started with the Beatles releasing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and it ended with Syd Barrett and Pink Floyd releasing Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It was everything that Bob had gone to the West Coast to experience, and yet he ended up watching it on TV instead. Why? Well, guys, I'll tell you. One day, someone walked up to Bob and asked him if he wanted any acid. Bob said, "Sure, I'll take some free acid," and the guy was like, "Free acid? You crazy kid? This is for sale." I forget if Bob said it cost $1 or $2, which these days is practically free, but the price was something like that. Bob said, "No, only if it's free, man." So the dealer is about to walk away when suddenly he turns around and says, "Oh wait, you can have this acid for free." And he handed Bob some paper from a different batch. Like he handed him something else, not the stuff he was selling. And Bob immediately took it and gobbled it all down. So this next part... So this next part is the part I forgot. Okay. But she's right. This is the way it went. Bob said that when the paper took hold, he had the most intense experience of his life. He became Thor, God of Thunder. When we repeated it back to him as Thor, God of Thunder, Uncle Bob corrected us. No, he was Thor, God of Thunder. Now, Thundar was a Jack Kirby Saturday morning cartoon. It was a current show when he's telling the story. It didn't exist in the Summer of Love, except Bob said it did that day. So by the next day, Bob realized this acid wasn't wearing off. It had been exciting, and then it was pleasant. But going to sleep and waking up while still in this intense trip was becoming pretty horrible for a poor innocent young Uncle Bob. It reached the point where he saw what he thought was a police officer, so he walked closer to see better. Even when closer, it still looked like a cop. So when he got up close to this object, he took a chance that it was a living human, and he said to the guy, "Excuse me, officer, but I am insane. Can you help me?" Now, if you ask any good cop to help you with your insanity, they will do just that. They will take you and bring you to a mental home, and they will have you committed. The cop had Bob put under 72-hour surveillance, and sometime during that period, the trip finally stopped. Now, if you've ever done that stuff, and I'm not saying you should, then you know that it will leave you feeling as tired and cranky when it's over, as it had you up high in the clouds while it was happening. So suddenly Bob's trip was over, and he was tired and bitchy, and locked up in a room under surveillance by very busy personnel who had no time for his emotional fits. Bob managed to piss off enough people in that hospital that he got himself committed to an institution for 3 months. And that was how Uncle Bob came to spend the entire summer of love in 1967 on Thorazine, drooling on himself in the community room of a mental home just miles from the images he was watching on TV of Haight-Ashbury and the summer of love unfolding all around him. So remember, we were like 20 years old when he was telling us this story. But so was his lesson like, don't do drugs, kids? Hell no. His message was, never trust one of those rock stars. I'm not kidding. He blamed rock stars for getting him committed. He hated rock stars. I loved psychedelic music back then, and I still do. Bob pretty much tried to hate anything I loved. He was jealous of anything I liked. He hated the Monkees for being auditioned for their roles, and he hated the Jimi Hendrix Experience for the same reason, because the rhythm section were hired to play with Jimmy and make him more commercial to a wider audience. But he loved Joan Jett and Sherry Curie and the Runaways, even though they were also auditioned and cast. And also, and the Sex Pistols and the Clash. But Bob had those bands marketed to him in a different way, so he wasn't able to see past it. Here's a sort of a nice story about Bob, kind of. One time, one of my writing partners and I had a chance to pitch to the Conan O'Brien show producers back before it was on the air. They were taking the old Letterman late-night slot and wanted animation ideas. Uncle Bob actually gave us a few of the ideas we pitched, and it was really one of his ideas that I think inspired cartoons that Robert Smigel made later on for Saturday Night Live, like the ambiguously gay duo. I say this because we pitched to Smigel that day. It was him and the other guy that used to produce Kids in the Hall, I forget his name. Ross? I think Ross. By the way, I'm not saying Smigel stole from us or Bob. His ideas were original. But I think he may have derived some inspiration from our pitch in terms of attitude. I mean, that's legit. We took it as a compliment and not a ripoff. Like, one of Uncle Bob's ideas was called the Beards. Actors had to hide that they were gay. It was the opposite of now. So the Beards were two gay people pretending to be straight to make money. And it was based on some people who were famous back then. Bob's sense of humor was pretty wicked. He influenced me comedically as much as Andy Kaufman or anyone. His poems were always really funny. And all of the lyric writing I've done for music is heavily influenced by both Bob's funny poems as well as his analysis of music lyrics and the intentions of various bands he had studied. Now, I had been a Ramones fan for a long time. I used to be backstage at their shows a lot when I was a teenager. And Bob hated the Ramones. I felt because I love them. And when I got hired to draw some stuff for Joey Ramone in 1989, Bob wanted to hire me to give him dirt on the Ramones for his new magazine, which was called Hard Rock Video. I wrote him a review of their then new album, but I loved the record, so Bob wouldn't print it. He wanted me to say bad stuff about Joey or about Arturo Vega, who I had worked directly with. But why would I do that? It's funny because a lot of the original punk generation go around saying bad things about me these days, but I've never ratted any of them out. Well, maybe one guy. But he ratted... So that's another story. Let's leave that out. Okay. Now, getting serious, Uncle Bob woke up one morning in Las Vegas, having just had a stroke, and he fell out of bed onto the floor, unable to move. It was only his girlfriend checking up on him that saved his life. That was the way he told it to me over the phone from Vegas. That was a very painful conversation. I don't know how much I should get into. I mean, if you look at Bob's Wikipedia page, it talks about him moving to Vegas and starting a career as a blackjack dealer. Blackjack for Bob was not a career. Blackjack for Bob was giving up on being an artist. In my opinion, the stroke and his remarkable girlfriend saving his life and taking care of him straight up until his death in 2020, that was all life angrily telling Bob that he didn't have the option of giving up. Because that's when Bob went back to writing, since he couldn't really do anything else. Obviously, it was supposed to be what he was doing all along. You can still find reviews he wrote for the online version of Fangoria during that period. He also wrote about pop culture on Facebook. Personally, it was really hard for me to be friends with him at the end. I'm not sure if we even really were. He revealed to me over the phone that he was angry at me that I got to work with Amy Poehler before she was famous. He said he was angry and he was jealous. Like, he said that. He used those words. I worked to help her early in her career for free. I didn't make a dime. She wasn't famous. What's there to be jealous of? But then after that, when I was doing a local show featuring a local female comedian, she revealed to me privately that Uncle Bob had been writing her fan letters since she started working with me. Like, he never told me he was contacting her behind my back. It was weird. It's not my place to say anything about how anyone else handles illness and death and all that stuff. It's not my place. I just hope Bob appreciated that woman that took care of him in Vegas all those years at the end. I hope he appreciated the chance to be recognized a bit toward the end, too. Being welcomed back in a limited role at Fango. I mean, Fango would never have come into existence if he hadn't fought so long and so hard and so crazily. I have two Uncle Bob stories I want to end with, and of course they both have to do with intoxication. One time I ran into Bob and we walked around the factory district in Manhattan. They had dance clubs and music clubs and art galleries mixed in with the old factories, and Bob was as drunk as I'd ever seen him. We passed a gallery and he dragged me inside and then started lecturing the people in there that none of the art in that gallery was as good as the art made by his friend, Peter Bernard. It was as embarrassing as hell. He was demanding that they exhibit my work. I was a cartoonist at the time. I wasn't making gallery art, you know. But that was what Uncle Bob was really like underneath all the anger and cranky bullshit. One year his TV broke and he couldn't afford a new one. This was long before computers, so no TV meant being cut off from the culture. My friends and I chipped in and bought him a nice new TV for his birthday. He seemed absolutely stunned that anyone would do this for him, because he knew none of us were rich either. So, of course he got angry and kicked us all out. But when it came time for my birthday that year, Bob gave me something very special. He gave me his last 2 hits of the original Legal Ecstasy, which he had been saving for a special occasion. He told me that it would make me love the entire world. Not love the entire world, he insisted. If I took that magic pill, I would love the world. He was right. I felt forgiveness for the entire world, for everyone. Except my father, but that would be a different video. So when I think of Uncle Bob Martin of Fangoria, I think of that ecstasy trip. I think of those few hours when the world actually seemed to make sense for a minute. And I know that if he's looking down, or up, and seeing this video, well, I know he hates it, and I know he's probably angry at me for making it. Or maybe he's moved past all that stuff. In which case he wouldn't really be Uncle Bob anymore. I love you, dude. Bye. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.